welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the 100 Years' War, right? Really quick shout out to all y'all guys for working so hard and actually being with me and stuff like that and getting after that like Renaissance artwork, research project stuff. I'm going to post that stuff to your Google Classroom so you can see your names and your artworks one more time. By the way, y'all had a lot of really great questions, and so the big thing about it is when you start your artwork research, okay? Go ahead, you are more than welcome to come up, ask me anything you want, ask me anything you need to. If you're having a hard time, because like some of you have like a building, some of you have a sculpture, some of you have a painting, and it can be a little bit difficult sometimes to know what is important and what is not, right? So if you want to go ahead and start your research and then come in before we start Thanksgiving break and just ask me about certain things you might need to focus on or certain things you might need to lean towards, just let me know, okay? But y'all are more than welcome to do that, and I'm going to go ahead and clip in my flip really quick that I actually recorded earlier this year that is absolutely fantastic on Joan of Arc and the 100 Years' War, right? So I refuse to ever record this stock content ever again because I just did it so good that one time, right? And I also need to go grade y'all's tests. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Details, right? 5 little details that you need to understand really well when it comes to talking about the 100 Years' War. First and foremost, Pierre, is like I said 2 seconds ago. It actually lasted 116 years, right? 116 years because it's from 1337 to 1453. Why don't they call it the 116 Years' War? That doesn't like really sound as good. The other funny thing about it is it really probably shouldn't even be called the 100 Years' War because it only really had 9 big battles in it, right? 9 big battles, and when you actually look at the historiography of the entire thing, it's actually several smaller wars that we just use the term 100 Years' War to cover the entirety of the thing. Kind of like when we talked about the struggle of the orders back in Rome, when the plebes kept going on strike repeatedly different times trying to get like different laws passed in ancient Rome. We call that entire event the struggle of the orders, right? Just like we call all these little wars cooked into one big war the 100 Years' War, right? Stop licking me. And so now, anyway, also though, there's going to be large periods of peace between everything because, you know, wars are really expensive. So they kind of kept having to like call an end to the war repeatedly just so they could actually raise enough money to keep fighting the war. Another big thing that of course happens during the war itself as well is the Black Death Plague, which actually breaks out in Europe 10 years into the war and causes a very long period of time where they actually don't fight like battles or wars during that time because you don't really want to fight a war like while everybody's dying, right? Well, I mean, this war led to people dying, but you know what I'm saying, while everybody's sick. So going into it, though, also something else that you need to understand, Pierre, is that England was actually crushing France for the large bulk of this war, right? England was whooping that French butt, right? Like, so for the most of this war, just because actually a lot of it had to do with a lot of messy alliances and also the fact that England just had a much more larger and reputable military, right? So if we're looking at this map right here, you can actually see what I'm talking about, Pierre, right? Do you see the different colors on the map right there, right? Everything in green actually represents England, okay? And this right here is that land called Aquitaine that actually Edward owned at the onset of the war that he was going to get stripped away from him by Philip VI, which starts the whole war originally. Now, going into it, though, as you can see, that green area expands quite a bit in the second phase of the war, and if we really look right here at the third phase of the war, they had controlled the entirety of northern France, right? So you're looking at a war where actually England was really kind of wrecking house for most of the entire thing. Now, going into it, though, also, and a lot of this also, Pierre, speaking of their military, that's actually a little just bit more developed, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the English had a certain weapon that the French didn't have, and it actually meant that they were going to actually do really well militarily. So, like, the English military was, like, super strong and very intense. And a big reason why is because a lot of really big modern weapons are actually going to make their debut during this war, and it's going to lead to very different shifts in the war. And actually, early on, England ends up winning a lot because they have this specific weapon, right? The thing known as the longbow, right? Or the Welsh longbowmen that are actually going to make their debut, not debut, but be really specifically used at this thing called the Battle of Agincourt, right? So going into it, you have to understand is that the French were actually using this as their archery formation during the early onset parts of the war. Now, the French crossbowmen was just not very efficient, right? It wasn't very efficient, as you can see in this little writing right here on the other side. They were very vulnerable to the English archers, right? Because it actually took a long period of time to actually reload them. If you lose the actual reloading device, the thing is now just a big chunk of wood. And also, crossbows don't fire arrows in essence. They actually fire these things called bolts. They're actually very small arrows that actually don't go very far, and they're not super accurate. Whereas a Welsh longbowman, hailing from Wales, the like area of like the Isle of England, they actually were very well trained, and they used what's called a longbow, right? And a longbow is much longer, hence its name, and you also aim it upwards. Now imagine for a hot second you have several hundred of these Welsh longbowmen, and you've got a French force charging at you. Now we're just going to rain arrows down on you to actually like really take out a huge chunk of your numbers. Now there's a very very, very, very good movie that's actually on Netflix that was actually made by Netflix, and it's called The King. And it takes place during the 100 Years' War. And Timothy Chalamet actually plays the main character, that of Henry V, right? He plays Henry V that actually goes into the Battle of Agincourt, because something that you need to understand is Edward III, the guy that started this whole war, died pretty soon on into it, okay? And going into it, you have to understand there's going to be, like, basically the war in its essence that lasted for 100 years all revolved around the same thing. Who is going to be the King of France? Who is it going to be? We want an English person to do it. We want a French person to do it. So at one point or another, there was a very, very large fight between the Mad Prince Charles, or excuse me, not Mad Prince Charles, the King Charles the Mad, Charles VI, and also against Henry V. And this famous scene from that battle kind of perfectly describes how the Welsh longbowmen were used.
Forever mock the sight of your callow disgrace.
Archers! Stop! Draw! Loose!
Exactly, right? Love that movie. Give it a watch if you're bored, right? It'll actually give you a really better understanding of the Middle Ages and how the entire thing works, okay? So going into it, though, also another big gun or, like, weapon that's going to make its debut are gunpowder weapons, right? Gunpowder weapons are going to make their very first debut during the 100 Years' War in the style of these things known as the very, very early on breech-loading cannon, which you can see right there, and then another one, of course, the earliest forms of guns, right, which would then later on be turned into these things called arquebuses, all right? So now going into it, though, you need to also understand that the alliances of this war were very messy, which is going to exacerbate the entire war and extend it into several more decades. And what I mean by the alliances are very messy is you need to just go ahead and write this down. Part of France actually allied with the English against the rest of France. And there are these people known as the Burgundians, right? See this little region right here in purple? Burgundy, right? Burgundy, or Burgundy, as we say it in English, actually allied with England against the rest of France for a large part of this war because they wanted one of their heirs to the throne to become one of the French kings as well. And also because there was economic ties between the Burgundians and the English, because the Burgundians actually were very well known for processing English wool and turning it into textiles, and they didn't want to lose this very, very high yield, high-earning economic setup with the English, so they actually allied against their own French people for a large part of the third phase of the war. So the Burgundians, of course, are going to go against it. So you had basically half of a French civil war and then half of an international war going on at the exact same time. So that's going to exacerbate everything as well. But the thing that we need to understand, though, is that one person is going to come along and is going to help them win this war. Because what we're looking at this is, in the long run, France does end up winning this war. So, but also, why? How the heck is France going to pull this off if they were getting beat the daylights out of them for a large part of the war? Where a lot of it has to do with the fact that France had a much higher population than the English did. They had better leaders as well, speaking of the Burgundians, because literally some of these later on leaders, like Charles VII, are actually going to make peace treaties with the Burgundians and bring them back into France, and they're actually going to then fight unanimously against the English, and they're going to kind of fix that whole messy alliance problem. And another big thing about it as well is the French used those new guns better than the English did, and it kind of negated that entire Welsh longbowmen thing. Now, going into it, though, also, you need to understand that when the French were on the brink of destruction, a certain person came along that was a very unlikely hero that led them to several victories that are going to kind of turn the entire tide of the war and really take the French on forward, and they're going to end up having a massive set of victories that will end up leading them into the eventual victory of the entirety of the war itself. And, of course, that hero is named none other than Joan of Arc, the girl that we the woman that we say a prayer to every day at our school this year. Saint Joan of Arc was actually present during the 100 Years' War and led the French to several victories. For example, the ones on the Leon River, and then not the Leon River. What is the name of that river? So several of them on the banks of the river in France that I gotta look up now. It's gonna drive me nuts. And then of course the other one is the Siege of Orleans is gonna be a very big one for her as well. But let's talk about Joan of Arc a little bit so we can better understand her and why she's so important and who she is as a person. This this person that we actually say prayers to all the time at school every day. Well, starting off, so you understand Joan's early life, Joan was actually born in the 1400s, right around, we think, 1412-ish, okay? Like right towards the end of the war, right about 1412, because of this entire thing ends in about like 1453, when the time she becomes like of age and actually starts leading this entire thing, it's going to be like getting into the latter phases of the war. She was born in a very, very small French town called Domremy, right? Domremy, to a peasant family, which was actually, they were a little bit weller off, right? Like in their town, they had the largest house and like the largest amount of land, but she was born in this very, very small village of Domremy. And in speaking of, if you're born in a very small village during this time period, and you're a woman, you're not going to be taught to do certain things, right? So something that you need to understand is that she grew up a massively devout Catholic, mostly because her mom was very, very devout Catholic. And the thing about it is, Joan of Arc never learned how to read and write. She was illiterate for the entirety of her life. But she was born, raised by her mom to be a very devout Catholic amidst the 100 Years' War, right? And amidst this entire war, she's going to actually start apparently receiving visions of saints at the age of 13. Right around when she turns 13 years old, she believes that saints like St. Peter and the Archangel Michael are two, for example, that are going to come start and speaking to her at the age of 13. Apparently, the very first day that she actually got like one of these visions, it was the couple of days after she was being bullied by some kids for being so devoutly Catholic, right? She was actually bullied as a young child because she always went to confession and she always studied her works and she always went to mass and she never missed it whatsoever. And because of her devout Catholicism, she got picked on by these other kids. And then soon after that, she apparently was working out in the garden and she heard a massive voice, and the voice goes, "Joan," and like calls to her, and she turns towards the village church and the church begins to glow with a golden aura. Now, interesting little fact about this, there is a church in Laplace, Louisiana called the St. Joan of Arc Church, which is actually decorated with gold paint and stuff like that on the outside to symbolize this moment, and the altarpiece behind the actual altar itself is gold as well, to symbolize that moment when actually Joan turned towards the church and began to hear the voices of these saints, right? And they told her a bunch of different stuff, but they basically early on when she was 13 told her that she needed to stay a very, very devout Catholic, right? And that she needed to actually commit herself to God and his works. So she takes a vow of celibacy at the age of 13, and she never does plan on becoming a nun, but she wants to try and live as much of a like devout Catholic life apparently as she possibly could, right? Now, by the age of 16, apparently the like direction of the saints' visions are going to change. And when she like hits about the age of 16, they tell her to go meet Charles Valois and take him to Reims so he can be crowned king. Now, this is a very important thing in French culture because the cathedral in Reims is the same exact cathedral where Clovis, the first king of France, was actually baptized and made Christian. Remember when we talked about that? Remember the whole thing where they baptized one of his kids and he actually died and it was a very, very big problem and he didn't want to convert from paganism for quite some time? Well, looking at this entire thing, he's not the king of France right now. He's supposed to be, but he's not. The current king of France is an English kid named Henry VI who's only 10 months old, right? Which is very embarrassing for the French. But what Charles needs to happen is he has to get to Reims so he can become crowned the king of France, usurp this 10-month-old baby that lives back in England, and it's going to be very, very difficult though. Because as you can tell when we're looking at the entirety of all these different areas, Reims is up here in this pink area that was controlled by the English. So they have to figure out a way to get past all of that and get closer inside of the actual like area controlled and occupied by the English people. And actually at the time, Charles Valois, who would later become Charles VII, was actually in this place called Chinon. And so the thing about it though is Joan is going to take this message very seriously. And she actually travels with an accompaniment of about 6 armed guards and stuff like that. And she goes off to try and find Charles and convince him to give her an army. And actually, this is a very, very big moment because she wasn't believed at first, right? The very first person that she actually went up to and said, "Oh, I've heard the voices of saints and angels, and I need to actually go to find Charles and reinstall him as the rightful heir to the throne of the Kingdom of France." The what are they called? The quartermaster of the village was like, "No," and sent her out and said, "Lord, I'm not going to give you a bunch of stuff, you lady. You should go back to your mom and she should give you a good beating," is what he said to her. And she leaves and then starts to actually talk to all the people in her village about the voices she's been hearing. And they actually come back with her and convince that guy to give her armor, a horse, and a bunch of other stuff. Now she does this, comes back with all these people behind her back, and he finally relents. He gives her some armor, gives her a horse, and she has to now travel 11 days to get to Charles to then convince him that she is her god as well. Now, the thing about it, though, is she apparently, when she was about to onset on her journey, she cut her hair very short, so she looked more like a boy, and she also wore men's traveling clothes, because they're actually sewn on the sides, and they were very hard to, like, rip or pull off, and it was for her safety and protection. So going into it, though, as well, she also apparently made very good friends with the guys that she was traveling with, right? There was about 6 men that were there to actually escort her there, and she apparently acted just kind of like one of the dudes the whole time, right? It's like just one of the boys in the sense of, like, literally she, like, palled around with them, talked with them, really, like, shared her interests with them, and would, like, sit around the fire and joke and play games and do all these other things on this entire journey to get to Charles VI, right? Or, excuse me, Charles VII, who is at the time Charles Valois. Now, how did Joan, though, prove to Charles when she got there that she had heard the voice of God? Well, apparently Charles heard she was coming, because it wasn't very, very uncommon at the time that, like, there were all these people running around saying that they had heard the voice of God. Mostly women at the time, too. So going into it, though, Joan has to find a way to prove to the, like, would-be king of France that she has actually heard the voice of God. Well, Charles apparently set up a series of tests for her and stuff like that. And what the entire process was, one of the big ones, legend has it that Charles actually invited her into a church where Charles would apparently be sitting on a very large chair at the front. But he actually didn't sit up there. It was actually somebody else that was dressed like him, and he was going to see if Joan went in there and actually talked to him instead. But then apparently Joan walked into this church, turned, saw Charles, and was like, oh my God, that right there is the rightful king. And she picked him out of the entire crowd, and she's never even seen him in real life, which is pretty wild when you think about it. But then, of course, another whole process starts where they check to see if she's a witch, and they like have a bunch of like priests ask her a buttload of questions. But after the entire process Charles is pretty convinced that he thinks that she has heard the voice of God, or at least she believes she has, right? And so the thing about it, though, is Charles gives her an army, right? Like, gives her an army of completely volunteers, because he literally goes out into the streets and he's like, who wants to follow this woman who apparently has heard the voice of angels and the archangel Michael? And over 1,000 volunteers show up to ride with Joan, and Joan is going to be their leader. And she rides out to save one particular city, the city of Orleans, right? The city of Orleans that New Orleans is actually named after. And so they need to go and take it over, because it's like the gateway into Paris and the gateway into northern France. And the entire process is it's being sieged for a long period of time by the English up to this point. Now, when she gets to Orleans with this 1,000-man volunteer army, and she's riding on a massive white horse, and she's wearing armor that is so shiny at the time that apparently it appears white as well. By the way, that right there is the Joan of Arc statue in New Orleans, right outside the French market in the French Quarter. There are 4 of those statues that exist in like real life. One is in Paris, one is in Philadelphia. I don't know where one of the other random ones is, but the 4th one is actually in New Orleans. And she actually rode out with a banner that on it said Jesus and Mary on it. And when she got there, do you think she was received very well? No, because she was a woman and she was illiterate and stuff like that. The man that actually was in charge of trying to like stop the English from seizing Orleans actually cut her out of meetings, locked her out of meetings, and refused to ever listen to her, right? This guy is now known as the Bastard of Orleans, is what a lot of historians actually refer to him as, because he refused to listen to Joan's words. But it didn't really matter, because Joan actually heard another vision, and like literally while she was like received this vision, jumped up out of her bed, threw her armor on, went and told her 1,000 men volunteers, we're going to attack the English right now. And she led a massive battle against the English at the siege of Orleans, and she wins. In the process, though, crazy enough, she was wounded. They almost lost the battle there for a minute because they thought they had lost their fearless leader, Joan of Arc. She got shot in the leg with an arrow, and it went 6 inches deep into her thigh. Or no, not into her thigh. That's the wrong one. Shot in the shoulder with the arrow, and it went 6 inches deep into her shoulder at first. And literally, apparently, she walked off, had the surgeon remove it, rips it out, and then she goes back into the battle and leads the men into victory. Now, in this process, though, she then leads, like Charles, to the city of Reims, where he would then be crowned, like, King of France. And he becomes Charles VII, usurping the 10-month-old king that's back in England and stuff like that, because nobody really wants a baby to be your king anyway. And he becomes King of France. Now, in this process, apparently, she was standing right next to him when he kneeled and took over the crown of France, and everyone says that God was with them in that moment. Now, getting into it a little bit, just wrapping up the Joan of Arc story, though, just so you understand, is that Joan of Arc, though, is going to have a very sad, tragic end to her life. Because what's going to happen after Charles is crowned King of France, Joan has to go rogue. Because what actually ends up happening is Charles kind of just cut her out and was just like, okay, thank you a lot, lady, that actually heard the voice of God. by and then just kind of like dismissed her and sent her packing. Well, Joan of Arc then decides that no, I don't want to stop at this point. I actually want to go off and I want to retake the capital. I want to retake Paris, right? Now, this was a massive mistake on Joan's part because the walls of like Paris are 30-something feet high. They're going to be borderline impossible to get over regardless of how big the army that you have is. Also, it's being defended not only by the English but by the Burgundians at this point as well. So after a series of failed battles, she was actually captured outside of Paris by the Burgundians, and she was unable to escape because this time she did get shot in the thigh with an arrow, and it went so deep they could barely pull it out. And she was captured at one of these battles and then sold to the English by Burgundians, right? By the Burgundians. Now, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, why didn't Charles intervene and save her when she was actually captured by these people? Well, the reason why is because Charles was like, I don't really think I need her anymore, and he just let her go, right? He let her go, and the English are going to actually put her in prison, and they're going to put her on trial, right? And they held her in a city known as the city of Rouen. And Rouen is actually in France itself, right? This is actually a picture of me in Rouen, actually this past summer. This is the tower where she actually received some of her trials and stuff like that. She was held in prison for over a year, and she was put in front of an Inquisition trial. And that Inquisition is going to be a panel of priests that tell her that she needs to admit to never hearing God, that she needs to say that she's a witch. Then they charged her with over 70 different charges, including witchcraft, heresy, and cross-dressing. Because apparently somewhere in the Bible it says that women are not supposed to wear men's clothes, which is like so silly and ridiculous. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, the other thing that what ends up happening is they actually forced her into a confession one night where they drug her out of bed at like 2 a.m. in the morning, brought her up to the gallows with a guy and an axe, and they said, we're going to chop your head off if you don't sign this piece of paper saying you never heard the voice of God. Well, apparently she did sign it cryingly, like said that she never actually heard God, but the reason why is because she was just so scared, right? And then what ends up happening, though, on May 13th, 1431, is one of the premises of the confession was that inside the confession that Joan of Arc signed, she said that she would never wear men's clothes ever again. Well, what had happened was, is she, like, literally, the English came up one day on her, and she was wearing men's clothes again. She was like, I have heard the voice of God. You just scared me and freaked me out. I refuse to take this back. And there you have it, right? And what ends up happening is Joan of Arc was burned at the stake on May 13th, 1431, where she would then like take her last breaths and be martyred for her faith, right? And so what ends up happening is the day that it actually came, apparently she entered into a deep meditative state and never screamed nor cried aloud the day that she was actually burned at the stake. And I've actually been to the church where she was burned at the stake, right here in this patch of grass. That is where she actually died. And apparently all she did was sit there in her meditative state and repeat the name Jesus over and over and over again. They then took her ashes and they dumped her into the Seine River, and later on she would be canonized in 1920 as the patron saint of France. But the big thing that you need to write down real quick is why is Joan of Arc so important? Is because France was losing battle after battle after battle until she showed up. And then they began to win several series of battles, and the Burgundians would eventually come back to the French power, and she basically led them into their early parts of their victory in the latter phases of the war, okay? But that is it right there. That is the stuff on the 100 Years' War that y'all need to know, and I will see y'all soon, and we'll talk about the Black Death Plague in our next class, all right? See y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.